This week, April Wright and I interview the former CEO and founder of Tenable Network Security, Ron Gula, now of Gula Tech Adventures. In the news, John Hancock requires monitoring bracelets to buy insurance, hackers are stealing credit card data all over the place, and the man who broke Ticketmaster. Stay tuned for all that and more on this episode of Application Security Weekly.
This is a Security Weekly production. Layered Insight is the industry's first embedded security approach for containers. Trusted by Global 1000 enterprises to secure their containerized applications, it's the only solution that requires no root privileges, has zero dependency on the underlying infrastructure, and is fully portable across any container environment. Unified DevOps and SecOps, enabling the rapid development of containerized applications without worrying about security. To learn more, please visit layeredinsight.com/ASW. Rapid7 powers the practice of SecOps. Using shared data, analytics, and automated workflows, SecOps unites IT, DevOps, and security teams to make security an outcome of innovation. Rapid7 combines technology, expertise, and advocacy to drive vulnerability management, application security, incident detection, and log management for more than 7,000 organizations worldwide. Power up your SecOps practice with a free trial at rapid7.com/securityweekly.
Welcome, everyone, to episode 33, our 34th episode of Application Security Weekly. I am, of course, your host, Keith Hoodlett, and I'm excited to be joined by my illustrious guest host, April Wright. April, welcome back to the show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it looks like it's decked out there for Halloween. I see that at least they're properly celebrating the holidays in order over there, which is important.
It is. It's a little creepy.
Yeah, just a little bit. And, of course, we're joined once again by Ron Gula. So Ron, it's great to have you back on the show. I imagine that you've been up to a lot of interesting things since the last time we spoke.
Hey, Keith and April, how's it going? I don't have any Halloween decorations here or Christmas.
There you go. Well, hey, man, as long as you didn't skip Thanksgiving somewhere in the middle, I think that you're probably okay. It's funny, whenever we go into stores these days, we're just like, it's literally the day after Labor Day and you already have Christmas stuff out or Halloween stuff out. And you think, we're not even like done with Labor Day yet. What gives? But in any event, speaking of Labor Day and other, national events of different kinds, of course, election security is on almost everybody's mind these days, as, of course, we're coming up to the midterm election. It's a pretty hot political climate today. And so, Ron, I know that you shared with us the Belfer Center documentation on state and local election cybersecurity playbooks that have recently come out. And tell us a little bit more. It sounds like you've been working with some of the parties to, talk about making sure that they're secure for this upcoming election.
Yeah, so it's very interesting. The elections right now, speaking of is the season, right? There's an election going on if you haven't been watching the news, right? There's nothing like that going on, and it may or may not be being hacked right now. And a lot of people in our industry want to give free products to election commissions, to campaign officials, and it turns out that there's all sorts of laws that says you can't really just do that. When you donate to a campaign, for example, even if you gave somebody a ride to the airport or bought them a meal, that's an in-kind donation, and that also includes cybersecurity. So from the election campaign's point of view, it's kind of hard to get them to spend money on anything other than trying to win our vote and communicate those messages. Now, the other thing is that the Trump administration came out with their new nationwide cyber strategy, and they basically added elections to that. If you go back to DHS and you look at their 16 areas of critical infrastructure, the election system wasn't in there. So one of the big things in this new strategy is basically tasking the Department of Homeland Security to make sure our election system is up to snuff and resistant to attack.
So what are some of the things that you've seen different, whether it's, Republican, Democrat, or otherwise, right? Different campaigns starting to make use of as a means of protecting their campaign, right? Because we saw last year, or excuse me, now 2 years ago, there was that breach of the Podesta emails, where basically people said, hey, if you had two-factor authentication, things would have been great, and maybe the election would have turned out differently, because that was a major kind of maybe distraction from other political events going on at the time. So what are some of the things that they're highlighting in this guidance that they've provided at the Belfer Center?
Yeah, so a lot of focus in the media has been on about changing a vote, and not changing my opinion of who I'm going to vote, but actually kind of doing it on the back end. I vote for one candidate and somebody hacks it and changes another. I actually think there's a lot more effort going on way before that. Not only try to influence how we vote, but who we can vote for. And I do believe that there are a lot of cyber attacks going against candidates, not necessarily who we even know by name. It might have been happening during a primary. Somebody who doesn't have a whole lot of funding, a whole lot of nationwide exposure, they might be compromised by a cyber attack. Maybe their family, maybe there's some dirt that's dug up. Maybe this was done by the media, by the opposition parties, maybe by a foreign state. So how do you combat that? The Belfer Center, which is in the show notes, basically, it's really a lot of cyber hygiene, but it really talks about the basic things you can do as a campaign. You should think of a campaign as a poorly funded IT marketing operation, with a lot of funding for marketing, but not a lot of funding for IT. So doing things like two-factor authentication, doing things like making use of cloud services. I mean, most of these people actually just use their personal emails and personal accounts. Where I think the document can go a bit further is to talk about things like voice security, right? There's secure texting, there's Wicker, there's different types of signals out there that can be used. Because we all know that a stingray to do cell phone intercept and text messaging intercepting is not that hard to get. And if I want to go after a candidate, that's a pretty viable technique for people to do that.
Absolutely. And to a lot of ways, it's one of those situations where I think a lot of people stop at simple things like two-factor authentication. But from what I understand, both from the sense of getting better devices or more secure devices, so there are a number of campaigns that it seems like they're switching over to iPhones, again, kind of for their innate security that's somewhat well touted within the industry. But I imagine they're doing a little bit beyond just that in terms of the vendor space, for example, right? So maybe they're looking at, okay, if we're using an email vendor, what sort of protections do they offer, for example? And I think you were mentioning just before the show that Microsoft is now going to be making some of their services available as well. Can you tell our listeners more?
Yeah, and if you think about this, you have to imagine when you give a candidate or a political person anything, that's an in-kind donation. Again, buying a meal, giving a ride, giving them a free cybersecurity cloud-based log analyzer, anti-phishing widget, right? Those are all things that are donations that have to be logged and whatnot. And people who do these things, they want to gain favor. They might want to gain favor with a certain political party. They might want to favor one over the other. So there's something called the Federal Election Commission that really kind of governs this, and they're made up of in this case, parties from both parties. They recently had a ruling that allowed Microsoft to allow the same kind of free services that you and I use to be a viable thing for candidates. And this might seem like really illogical to people out there, because what they're giving away for free is the reason why it was allowed to be used. In other words, since there was millions of people already using it for free, it wasn't a whole lot of effort to say, well, the Democrats and the Republicans can go ahead and use that. What I'm hoping is that there's going to be even more hearings like that out of the FEC, so that we can get some better products in there. Viewers who read the CyberWire, for example, they'll notice that there's been a lot of companies reported to offer free things. For example, CrowdStrike right now, if you're any election at all, you can download the product and use it for free. You've got to really kind of track that, though. Is that an in-kind donation? Is that something you really want to take on as a liability? Do you have servers that have nation-state malware on them that you want to have CrowdStrike go after? Those are the kind of things you have to worry about.
Well, not to mention, too, I'm sure that there's the maintenance element to it as well, right? So CrowdStrike, though being a fairly robust system that you can deploy on your actual systems that you're using for the campaign, whether it's laptops or servers, for example, if you're not looking at the logs or if you're not looking at any of the alerts, does it really matter, right? At the end of the day, it can protect you and block certain things, but at some point that needs some full-time assistance to actually look at those things and actually work through the problems that arise. So Whereas I think that, as you pointed out earlier, moving toward the just good hygiene practices, so stronger passwords, two-factor authentication, maybe even, of course, protecting the voice communications, right? So if you need to, for some reason or another, share a password, heaven forbid that you do, right? But if you should need to, and reasonably within a campaign, by the way, people are probably doing that. Being able to communicate that securely is, of course, very important as well. Now, Ron, I want to turn just a little bit to some of the recent events that have happened in Georgia, and of course, the DEF CON hacking village was somewhat both lauded and shamed for their hacking village of voting systems. But in, I believe it was West Virginia, we covered a couple of weeks ago, and now also in Georgia, there's a lot of discussion around electronic ballots, right? So being able to cast your vote with your phone, for example. And so to that end, I didn't know if you had any thoughts on that element. I know that when we had April on last week, we discussed it a little bit in the news segment, but I wanted to see if you had any additional thoughts. Again, given your history and your background, especially at Tenable Network Security, and of course before that, your work for the government.
I forget the exact vendor for the electronic voting machine, but one of the vendors there was interviewed by Cyberscoop. And he actually said he disagreed with the DEF CON findings, and they had their own processes out there. And an article like that's really interesting because it's kind of hard to take people at their word. Both the hackers and the people that are doing the defense, because there's just so many people who are they all have goals to kind of get out there. But what I thought was interesting about this particular article, though, was he said, we actually use the Center for Internet Security and we monitor our networks with the Albert sensor. And I think a lot of people didn't realize that the Center for Internet Security actually has a thriving MSSP offering, and they run the multi-state ISAC. And they actually target, and they're funded by DHS to provide overwatch and detecting attacks against the electoral system. So I think that's actually really, really something that's not get played up a lot, because a lot of people are like, hey, what are we doing? It's so complex. Can we do anything? Is it too late? There's a lot being done. I think there's more that can be done, but there is a lot being done already.
So I'm looking at this Belfer Center playbook. And first of all, I'm a little disappointed there's no mention of blockchain.
No blockchain.
No blockchain. This is I found this part interesting. It says brainstorm the most damaging scenarios, and it gives you some examples of like rumors about things and credit card donor information being stolen, things like that. I think that's a really good point. If you're trying to create or trying to figure out what your threat model is for your campaign, you need to understand what the threats are. And by thinking about them, then you can put your resources into the places that matter the most. So if you're going to implement something that is free, you want to make sure that you're doing it for the right reason, not just because it's free. Do you disagree?
Yeah, it's actually still a really difficult problem to do, because let's say that April runs for a Senate position, and you've got your trusted staff, you got your volunteers, you got everybody who's working on your system. Well, half of those volunteers they're not even part-time people, they're volunteers. And what data do you share with them? How much do you let them know about who your donors are? Who communicates with your donors? Now let's say you get elected. Well, now you're a government official. So now if you're going to have that conversation, you have to have it not only on your government email, but working with people who are outside of that. And even if you're trying to comply with the law, and most politicians I deal with are trying, they're always asking questions like, well, can we send this email? Can we not, talk to this person? Can we work with this group? Can we not work with that group? And trying to do security in that environment is even harder. So I do think the Belfor study there, the guidance makes a good point, trying to figure out what you're doing and what you can and can't do.
What I also found interesting in this, and they have a section on election night reporting, which, especially for national races, right? So for congressional or senatorial seats, those tend to be the things that make it onto major news media. But I'm sure that there are a lot of other local elections that cover things like the governor's race, or perhaps, state senators, for example. What I found interesting here is they actually have an entire section on election night reporting, which I believe in at least some countries is one of those situations that I think it's maybe France specifically that comes to mind, that you can't actually do any sort of like exit poll reporting until, of course, you end up with the polls being completely closed. Now, to me, it sounds like they're considering not only the situation of everything leading up to the election, but during the actual voting process. It looks like they cover quite a bit, both in terms of the communications mediums, working with the volunteers. This is actually a really intense, but also quite robust document. In fact, they even have some stuff on social media, which I think, as we all would agree, is definitely a key arena for political debate at this point in time. So let's switch gears a little bit, though, Ron. Of course, being with Gula Tech Adventures now, you're doing quite a bit of investing in a number of different companies, and I believe that April had a couple of companies that we wanted to talk about here, and also I remember you mentioned Nano VMs at the top of this. So let's start with Nano VMs. First of all, to me, it's like, what do you mean Nano VM? It sounds like just another container. What is this company, and what are they trying? Like, what problem are they trying to solve?
So, coming out of Tenable, I really wanted to get things where you had companies focused on the cloud and companies who were focused on-prem. And Nano VMs is a company that kind of gives you the benefits of the cloud, but on-prem. If you think of the natural evolution of things, you had applications running on bare metal. You had virtual machines where you get all the benefits of virtual machines, and VMs waking up if you have an outage and whatnot. And then we went to containers, where instead of running a full copy of Linux or Windows or whatever operating system we have, we just run the app. And then we go to serverless. And we'll probably talk about Lambda and Amazon here in a second. But what happens to somebody who wants to stay on-prem and they can't run all the benefits of Amazon or Google Cloud or Azure? What can they do? Are they going to be living on VMware forever? So unikernels is basically a way to run your DevOps code, so your small pieces of code, your APIs, your microservices, on a VM that's basically carved down to just what the VM needs to run. If you think about what happens with a container, you take your API, your microservice, and you run it on top of a container, which runs on a full OS, a full VM maybe. That's still quite a big attack surface. If you could just run that code on top of APIs that were just in a kernel that you needed, that's all that was there, not only have you tremendously limited the attack surface and made things like, kernel exploits, really difficult because you're rolling these kernels, every time you change your API, you also create these VMs that boot in like 50 milliseconds, which means you don't have to have hundreds and hundreds of VMs sitting around for all your microservices and containers. You can just have them sitting in this environment and fire them up when you need them, in much the same way that people are looking at Lambda and Amazon, the whole serverless market.
It's interesting looking at the site as well. So it's Nano VMs or Nano VMS, so VMs.com. Mm-hmm. What strikes me about this is, first of all, it's a single process, which is interesting to me, especially depending on what you're trying to run. It sounds like there are very good use cases for web servers, for example, or websites to be delivered from this, but also then no users and no shell. So in my mind, I immediately go to kind of the continuous delivery model or the DevOps model, and I say, great, we shouldn't have any users and we shouldn't actually have any shell access. It's literally, I just want it to spin up my application, and if something breaks, then we have to go back and maybe fix the code and then ship the application again. So yeah, I mean, I like the kind of their slogan here, which is less code is less exploits, or less code equals less exploits, which is absolutely true. The best kind of debugged code is the kind you delete because you don't need it anymore. So this is incredible. Now they have both products and services. Are they helping companies to kind of make use of the unikernel space, or are they also just basically the services is setup and maintenance of what they offer from a security standpoint?
Yeah, so this is fairly bleeding edge. This is not something where we have thousands and thousands of people running this every day. This is new, but I think this is the future, and I do think this is a way for people who are on-prem to get a lot more value, not only of the servers and equipment that they have, but to solve some other problems. One problem is, if you're going to code something, you need a developer, and there's a lot of code that's already been written that's not going to get put into Lambda. It's not going to get refactored into a container or a microservice. So what do you do if you're a government agency and you've got piles and piles of .NET code sitting out there? And what can you do? So one of the reasons I really like nano VMs is this just isn't for Linux kernels. They can do it for .NET as well. So part of that service is they have a number of proof of concepts going on right now where there's legacy old .NET, Windows 2K code lying around that's still being used, and they can actually bring that in to this nano VM environment. So I think that by itself is just amazing.
So
That's incredible. Go ahead.
In a serverless model, and we were talking about continuous delivery, security has a hard time already with like agile, trying to keep up, doing pen testing, doing QA, things like that. So in the serverless model, where devs are continuously pushing, how do we maintain like separation of duties and QA and keep up with the releases that are constantly happening?
Yeah, so I don't have a great answer to that. At Tenable, we had a lot of apps written in the DevOps, in the container world, but we still had apps that were kind of written and managed in a more traditional development cycle. And as I extrapolate that to my experience with Fortune 200 CIOs and brand new startups who are 100% serverless and cloud and whatnot, there's still a lot of variety out there. The biggest issue is we don't have enough developers to do everything. So there's never enough stuff to get fixed. There's never enough. There's always something else that hasn't been either rewritten or refactored. Legacy is still a big thing, kind of hurting the industry, because who wants to work on old legacy code? I want to work on the new project and that kind of thing. So a statistic I track, and there's nothing I can really cite here, but just anytime I meet a CISO or CIO, I go, how many apps do you have that are basically legacy apps that you're not going to touch for 4 or 5 years? And the typical answer is half of my apps. And it varies based on industry, especially the older ones, like the financial ones and the insurance folks. So that's definitely something there. What I think is interesting, though, in your question is that we've got this SecDevOps kind of model and this one motion, and then we have this other motion over here where we're hunting APTs, we have incident response, we're trying to do cyber hygiene. I have yet to see both of those things converge. I have yet to go into some place where I see a SOC or an outsourced EDR, and they got the alerts from the web app being fed directly into that process. It's those things I haven't really seen that come together just yet out there.
Do you think that the logging capabilities of serverless are adequate for doing forensics and the blue team activities?
I think they are, but they go into the blue teams, not the blue team, they go into the apps people. So people who are designing the app are watching the app and monitoring the app, and they're making changes to that app faster than perhaps the SOC and the MSSP. Now I'm overgeneralizing, right? But if you're a bank and you've got 500,000 endpoints out there, and you've got 4 apps that are in a DevOps land, the motion to look at those 500,000 endpoints is completely different than watching all the data from that. So maybe they don't need to be integrated, but I'm usually seeing that there's no real communication to those things at all. Especially if I'm going to hop into one of those 500,000 endpoints and then hit a backend database or a backend data store component for that app that's being written and developed by other people. That's where I'm not seeing that unification, really happen in practice.
I guess that makes anomaly detection a lot more important.
And April, I wanted to make sure as well, I think that you had a couple of companies that you wanted to ask Ron about that, of course, Gula Tech Adventures are investors in. So I wanted to make sure we had an opportunity to cover those as well. But to your point, Ron, I think that it is important for security vendors and security tooling in general to provide a rapid feedback loop into development teams, because they're bigger than us, right? They have more manpower. They generally care a lot more about the performance of the application. And so if we can include both, performance metrics as well as maybe some of that security tooling in the process, I think everyone is better served for it. So that's really awesome to hear. Again, April, you had a couple of companies as well that you wanted to ask more about.
Yeah, in particular, Scythe is one of the companies, and they do attack simulation. So it said on the site that the red team can give the blue team something realistic to hunt. And I think that that's really important, especially for training and testing and things like that. So I thought this was particularly interesting. How do you fit attack simulation and a tool like that into like a larger security program?
Yeah, thanks for asking that. So in many ways, Scythe is a red team tool. I like to say emulate, because there is a category of companies such as Threat Care and Attack IQ that simulate. They will put files on disk and packets on the wire and see if you can find them. And that's great. That's a form of instrumentation, checking everything's working, but it's not something that I can go hunt with. If I've actually got my my NSM, right? I'll just drop a bunch of names. I got my Darktrace, right? I got my Awake Networks. I've got my Eastwind. I got whatever I have out there watching my network, feeding to my SIM, doing my anomaly stuff. If we're actually going to do a real attack and do some exfiltration with some real command and control stuff, that's how you know if you've got things working correctly or not. And that's really what Scythe is. So Scythe is more of an extension to a red team's toolkit of how do you actually go and maintain access. And the way I talk about it is this: I go, how long does a pen test take? And I usually get a question, I'll get that answer to that. Well, maybe a day, maybe a weekend, maybe a week. And I'll go, well, how long does most breaches last? And they say months, maybe 6 months. The major breaches all lasted that long. And I go, well, why isn't the red team simulating that? And I'll usually get a question like, well, we beat up on the blue team too much, or we're already giving them too much to do. And I'm like, those are all great points. But don't you want to simulate and train your blue team against the threat that's out there? And that's what Scythe makes easy. So you basically roll your own ability to maintain access. You roll your ability to do command and control. You run it like a campaign. And the thing that I'm most happy about Scythe is I can actually have less skilled people doing it. This is very similar to when I got involved with Tenable. People had Nessus, but they had maybe their 30 or 40 toolkits. And it really took them a while to trust Nessus and trust the output of that. If you ever watched a modern pen tester today, that's where we're at today. They've got all these different tools, all these different scripts, and they are experts in that. And that's awesome, and I don't want to take anything away from them. But what about the next 3 or 4 people we're going to train for that job? Is that the way we should be doing things? Now, I would say yes, but we have a huge people problem, and Scythe really allows your junior level pen testers and red teamers to act like nation state pen testers, and at least simulate a viable threat, especially if you're going up against Fortune 2000 adversaries.
So I don't want to take away from the special sauce or the secret sauce of Scythe, but I want to ask a little bit more about, can you tell me something about how they feed back data to the customer? Is it all in a platform? Is it by report? Is it maybe some sort of like plugins to IDE environments, or to even, rule generation for firewalls? Like, what sort of feedback loops does Scythe provide, if you can share a little bit of that information with us?
Yeah, so at the end of the day, you're doing a campaign, and you might be delivering your campaign via email. You might be using the InfoSec Advantage and simply deploying your access as an executable, whatever you want. You could be simulating a supply chain, a supply side, injection, that type of stuff. But once you have your operation up and running, everything is logged. And they log it in a really nice report. They know how much data they've exfiltrated. They know which commands were run. And that can be fed directly to Splunk, and you can export that report to other things. The idea is this. When I was running Tenable, we would be able to come in and do a very comprehensive cyber exposure report, which is basically real-time continuous compliance with any framework you want. And people would still go, okay, that's great. I'm weak in this part of the NIST cybersecurity framework, or maybe we could do better in PCI over here. But there was still this gap in between what people believe from an audit and continuous monitoring point of view versus what else is out there. And the thing I like about Scythe is you can say, well, look, we're auditing this group over here. Yes, they've got a good compliance report, but we've actually got 5 implants and ops running right now, and it hasn't been detected. Or perhaps we had an implant running and we had it use a simple type of command and control, clear text, or I don't want to get into all the details and whatnot, but you could start ramping things up and sort of see how well somebody can use to detect it. Another example use case is, let's say you have a typical managed security service where They are monitoring your IDSs and your firewalls, and they have a SOC and they have escalations. That type of service is a lot different than one of these new MDR type services that's really looking for the hunt mission and the needle in the haystack. When you deploy Scythe in an environment like that, you can actually test two different vendors and see how well they do on this. This is actually a pretty important decision that people are trying to make right now, but they don't have all the tools to simulate the latest and greatest in things that the nation states and hackers are throwing at them. The last thing I'll talk about is threat intelligence. A lot of people have mountains and mountains of threat intelligence, but they really don't know what to do with it. You can try to filter everything, perhaps with the threat intelligence gateway, and that is very useful. But if you have somebody who's actually attacking you and you know the tools and techniques, you can go to Scythe and you can basically do a red team test, a tabletop test, and actually simulate what it's done and see how well your organization responds at trying to hunt that, detect it, and mitigate it.
How do you prevent?
That's awesome.
It is awesome. But how do you prevent it from being like misused and weaponizing Scythe almost? Are there safeguards and controls and things?
Yeah, it's the beauty of that is licensing, right? So you can't buy a copy of Scythe that works on the internet. It's going to be limited to a domain, network, that type of thing. And the other cool thing is that most red teams, the tools they have no built in. A lot of these open source tools that come down, you could hack anybody you want. At least with Scythe, you got some professional logging and a sense of who did what and when, which I like because inevitably during a red team test, if something goes down, like the router goes down or the website reboots, you blame the red team. So having a nice audit trail of all that stuff is actually useful as well.
That's true.
And April, I know that you had another company as well that you wanted to ask a little bit more about for Ron as well. So go ahead and jump in.
Well, we talked about serverless. I think that was primarily what I was looking at. But I mean, it seems like there's with all of these technologies, we're putting a lot of trust into the provider. So with traditional cloud or nano or serverless, what do we need to expect from the provider as a user of these systems when we're using them almost like a black box?
Yeah, now when you talk about provider, April, are you talking about cloud like Azure versus Amazon versus Google?
Exactly, or whoever we're getting the service from. The CSP.
So it's really interesting, and the cloud, it's I'm going to get religious on you here for a second. They're all cloud, right? And if you're religious, you're all trying to go to heaven. They all have different ways to get there, and if you look at Azure, they're very open about all the different certifications they have, all the different types of audits they have, all the different ways that you can do things. If you look at Google, not so much. Amazon, a bit more. They're the most advanced of all of everything that's out there, but they have clearly different ways of going about and solving these issues of how do you develop, how do you audit, how do you ensure what's out there. What I want as a consumer, I want to know that the same way that I can see something made in China, assembled in the USA, or if I'm buying food and I see, certain things, I kind of want to know if I'm buying an app, is it an Amazon backend? Is it an Amazon highly available backend? Amazon had a couple glitches, and there was a couple providers who went down because some of their components didn't take advantage of a lot of what Amazon did. So in some cases, the providers are doing everything right. They're giving people all the tools, but maybe there's some vendors who are not taking advantage of all those things, and they're saying, yeah, we're good. We're in the cloud, highly reliable, highly uptime, all that kind of good. You can trust us. Well, maybe it's not the provider's fault. Maybe it's the vendor's fault. So I would love to see some, I'm not a regulatory guy, but I'd love to see some more transparency and these vendors who are making use of the cloud providers. What parts are they making use of? And what does it mean to me as a consumer so I can make a better risk decision?
One of the things that really concerns me is the lack of security education that developers are coming out with. So when they're put on the front lines and they're developing code and pushing it directly to a serverless application, let's say, how do you think we can improve education, or how do the companies need to be training developers, or should they be getting that training beforehand? How do we make it so that developers are more security minded and more able to contribute to being the front lines of defense?
So I like what's happened with the industry where we've had, Veracode, now at Computer Associates. We have Cigital, that got acquired by Synoptics. There's a lot of different code auditing out there. But then there's this concept of auditing code in production in pretty much near real time. You've got Tinfoil, you've got Sonatype, you've got all these different people they look at this problem as not only continuous assessment, but they look at it from like a runtime point of view. They look at it from a assembly line supply chain point of view, and this is good. The problem is I can still go and pay somebody to set up a website and put a basic form on it and see, cross-site scripting, SQL injection, basic things that have been around for 10, 15 years. So what do? We've got the bug crowds out there. We've got the Synax. We've got HackerOne. We've got all those people who are doing that. It's kind of hard to then say, well, is the industry not being responsive? I think what's happening is we just have so many new websites, so many new APIs, and so many people. Perhaps the percentage of people that are writing bad code is going down, but the actual number of bad coders is increasing. That's kind of what I'm suspecting. People are a lot more, attuned to this type of problem, but we haven't killed it at all. No, not at all.
It's almost as though part of the problem that we have is the ability to now write code is ubiquitous, right? You can go and learn it off of YouTube from like Free Code Camp. You can actually go to boot camps, or even, if you decide to do the university or the college route, or even, some sort of vocational school, there's a lot of opportunity to learn how to code. And I think that part of the problem, to your point, April, is that we don't do a very good job of pushing that down into the university or the education system as part of just kind of the natural process. But I do think that in some ways, to Ron's point, especially with like the Sonatypes of the world or the Tinfoils, et cetera, we're starting to offer more opportunities for developers to write code without having to consider security, because the frameworks like React.js, for example, are starting to build those things in so that the developers just don't have to think about them. As listeners have, perhaps heard me say before, I think of application security as kind of like the wind. It shapes the world around you in terms of the way that the leaves blow or the grass moves, but it doesn't obstruct the view of development or what they're trying to accomplish from a final delivered service. And so, that's a problem that I think we still have a long way to go. But at the same time, I think that there's still a lot of opportunity for us to perhaps build things in where they don't have to think about it. It just comes by default. So
it used to be that I would take somebody else's open source code, put it in my code, and then I'm halfway there. And the future is, I don't take somebody else's open source code. You go against an API. And if those APIs are part of the Amazon infrastructure, then so be it. If part of the Azure infrastructure, then so be it. But the less code I have to write and the more APIs I call, the better I am. Because just like any other human endeavor, whether it's writing music, being an athlete, being an author, there's a tremendous amount of people who are involved in that endeavor, but a very, very small people who actually get published or noticed. It's the same thing with code. A very, very small percentage of people actually write most of the software applications that we use on a daily basis.
Should developers then be focusing more on design and architecture versus coding in terms of security? If it seems like that would be the future if we're moving into APIs and style guides and libraries and things that people are using.
I try to advise a lot of different people who want to get involved with cyber, with IT, with programming, that if you're not cut out to be a programmer, you shouldn't go into programming, right? But maybe you're an engineer and you might understand software lifecycle management. You might understand the components of how a network works or a cloud works. That might be really what makes you think. I'm not that good of a programmer, but I really think I understand architectures end to end. And that is going to be actually a lot more interesting for organizations going forward than actual just people who can write a brand new algorithm, right? It's going to be, how do I make this connect? How do I get this legacy stuff to talk to the new stuff? And those are interesting problems. Cyber is such a big opportunity. I tell people they should pick something that they like, and they shouldn't not do cyber because they don't like, programming. It's the same thing as I want to help people and be nice and have healthy families, healthy children, but I don't like blood, so I don't want to be involved with healthcare at all. There's plenty of things you can do in healthcare besides, operating and stuff like that. And it's the same thing with cyber.
It seems like it leaves the possibility for larger, harder to fix problems when we're dealing more with flaws in architecture, flaws in design, rather than bad code like OWASP Top 10 or something like that. It seems like it would be harder to fix flaws that occur if that's the model that we're moving towards.
It's really interesting because on one hand, you don't want to tell people to like, hey, hide in your little corner of the internet and do everything with best practices as best as you can, right? Because you can't be on the internet and survive in that matter. On the other hand, if we told everybody, hey, we should go all in with Azure. Let's just pick on Microsoft, right? We think they're the best. Let's go all in with that. Well, now you've created a huge monoculture and a huge target. So just as a society, we're going to keep going back and forth with these things. And that's where I think the architects of the future and the engineers of the future are going to be able to help engineer, the best solutions for whatever you're doing, whether it's a hot new mobile app, the next thing after Fortnite, or, the hot new messaging app that we have to use for the FBI. All of those are completely different use cases and need different types of designs.
So with that, I did want to say that this is an awesome conversation. And I think that, as the future progresses, we either see a couple of things happen, which is either security professionals get look more like developers, and almost the same way you call someone a doctor, but they might be a brain surgeon versus someone that does, blood work versus any number of other things, right? So there's a lot of specializations there, and I think that we see convergence on everybody eventually codes, but they have a specialization, some perhaps in security architecture and so forth. But with that, I did want to thank you again, Ron, for coming on the show. This has been awesome.
Thank you, Keith. Thank you, April.
In just a minute. Awesome. Thank you.